Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. Welcome to Memorial Church and to the PC room here at our Memorial Church. My name is Matthew Ichihashi Potts. I'm the Plummer Professor here at Harvard and the minister of this church. And it's we're very happy to welcome you here to the church, and we're also very happy to welcome our lecturer, Professor Magda Teter. Magda Teter is Professor of History and the Shvidler Chair of Judaic Studies at Fordham University, as well as the current president of the American Academy for Jewish Research. She is the author of several very highly acclaimed books, Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, published by Cambridge in 2006, Sinners on Trial, Jews and Sacrilege After the Reformation, published by Harvard in 2011, Blood Libel, On the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, published by Harvard also in 2020. This book won the 2020 National Jewish Book Award, in addition to several other awards, and then most recently, Christian Supremacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Antisemitism and Racism, which was published by Princeton in 2023. Professor Teter has authored dozens of articles and essays in English, Hebrew, Italian, and Polish, and she has been a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, the National Endowment for Humanities, and our own Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. It truly is an honor to have a scholar of her caliber here at the Memorial Church preaching to us, or talking to us on such, I'm a preacher, sorry, speaking to us on such an important topic at this time, but in all ages of Christian life. Her lecture tonight is entitled, as you can see, Christian Legacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Antisemitism and Racism. Professor Teter, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor. I remember being here at Harvard and passing by the Memorial Church so many times and never imagining that I would be speaking, not preaching, in the church. So again, thank you for having me. We're really in dark times, times where a real problem of anti-Semitism is being used for political gains and political reasons, leading, I think, to coming backlash and manifestations of further manifestations of anti-Semitism. So I'm really grateful that we're having these conversations, especially here, which a university which is now at crosshairs of the current administration. That there were links between anti-Semitism and Christianity is not a new idea. This proposal came from Reverend James Parkes in 1934 in his seminal book on the roots of anti-Semitism, Christian roots of anti-Semitism. But most of the scholarship and most analysis and most thinking has focused on the stories in the Gospels, or certain vignettes and moments in the Gospels. So the crucifixion story and the leading accusations of deicide, that Jews killed Jesus, that sort of served as tropes for Jewish cruelty and enmity, including in modern times, enmity towards the world. And then the trope, the image of Judas that served to create the kind of idea of distrust and, of course, greed and money that came to be associated over centuries with Jews more broadly. But these stories would have been, were really, local stories of ancient Judea and Galilee, and would have remained so, and we wouldn't be in this room had not Christianity stepped out of this sort of intra-Jewish or Judean discourse and expanded into the Roman Empire and among non-Jews, into areas where there were no Jews at all as well, in the Roman Empire and then later beyond. And with that expansion, Christians took the texts in which they grappled with the contrast, the growing new identity, the idea of how to separate oneself and differentiate oneself from the Jewish sects and Judaic traditions that were there. And one of the aspects that I've probed in my work are the hierarchy of values that are embedded in the early Christian texts that again are grappling with that idea of difference and between Judaisms of the time and the emerging Christianity. So hierarchy of values, the Jews and Judaism functioning as contrast figures to Christianity, and then also embedded in this surprisingly idiom of power. And it's surprising because the earliest texts come from a tiny group of persecuted Christians who are not in any position of power. But yet there are these, the language that is theological that will have, as Christianity expands and becomes and asserts itself also on a political level, will have real life consequences. So, was it not going? Okay, here we go. So Paul, Apostle Paul is an author of the earliest Christian texts we have in history. He writes at the time when the Jerusalem temple is still standing, when Jews still practice the sacrifices, when Judaism is really functioning still within the confines of Jerusalem and Judea, although Jews are also having synagogues and reading scriptures. There's no Hebrew Bible yet, there's no Tanakh, there are different scriptures still, right? So as he's writing, he has embraces a faith in Jesus. He is trying to both reach out beyond Jews, but also try to explain to non-Jews how different this new faith is from Judaism that they may be familiar with. So he talks about, and here he sets up a contrast that also embeds within itself a hierarchy of value. So he contrasts the works of the law, which in Greek is nomos, but what could be translated also, the word is could be translated as the Torah, because that word, the Torah, or the commandments of God, are sometimes the same word in Greek, which is the language he writes, but through faith in Jesus Christ. He later in the letter to Galatians, who he's upset with because they are adopting Jewish practices, he's trying to tell them not to do this. And then he turns to an allegory of law and faith, and he uses the story of the two sons of Abraham, one by Hagar, and Ishmael by Hagar, who was a slave woman, as you know, and Sarah, Yitzhak by Sarah, the wife of Abraham. And again, he associates that with, one attaches the meaning to the present, to Judaism and the practices of Judaism, and another he attaches to Christianity. So, and I highlighted in blue those words and phrases that he attaches to Judaism, and in gray those that he attaches to Christianity. So you can see one slave woman, free woman, one according to flesh, the other according to promise. They represent two covenants. One on Mount Sinai, very explicit, right, giving of the Torah, bearing children for slavery. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to present Jerusalem. Again, remember present Jerusalem, the temple is still standing, for she is in slavery. But the other woman corresponds to the Jerusalem of above, the heavenly Jerusalem, and she's free, right? So as he's putting it, there's a clear attachment of value in these: the flesh, the promise, the heavenly, the present, slave-free. These are not neutral terms, and these are not certainly neutral terms in Paul's times. And then he, in the episode of the Romans, he writes, not all Abraham's children are his true descendants. It is through Isaac, right, that the descendants shall be named. This means not the children of the flesh, but the children of the promise. And of course, Jews are tracing the lineage through Isaac, but he, in his allegorical interpretation, he flips the script. And then, crucially, in a passage that has nothing to do with Judaism and Christianity, but has to do with his reflections on God's election, of what we might perhaps call predestination, he uses the phrase from the book of Genesis, the elder shall serve the younger, to refer to Jacob and Esau. And I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau. That phrase has the language of power, right? Serving one serves the other, and that will be a phrase that will have ramifications later on, and will be interpreted by other first theologians and then also attached to law. So I'm skipping many centuries. In my book, I spend a little bit more time on this. Augustine, who's writing at a point where Christianity is now the religion of the empire. So in an entirely different political moment, the political moment that's actually flipped. Jews no longer have any political sovereignty over Judea. Since 135, Judea is now, it doesn't exist. It was renamed Palestina by the Romans. Jerusalem doesn't exist. It's renamed Aelia Capitolina. But by the time Augustine writes, Christianity is now not only a recognized religion, not a persecuted religion, but is the religion of the empire. And he returns to many of the ideas and texts of Paul. So he returns to the contrast of the two covenants, old and the new, earthly and heavenly, one in servitude, one in freedom, one in shadows, one light, right? And again, I kept the blue for those associated with Judaism, and the gray for those associated with Christianity. And then he talks about the citizens of the earthly city who are corrupted by sin, but those who are in heavenly city are brought forth by grace and freed from sin. The former are called vessels of wrath. The others are called vessels of mercy. So again, sometimes it's not explicit, but these attachments, these negative, pejorative attachments to Judaism have significance. And then he returns to the phrase, the elder shall serve the younger. And look how he interprets it in this political moment that he's writing. As to the statement, the elder shall serve the younger, scarcely anyone among us has understood it to mean anything else than the elder people of the Jews should serve younger Christian people. And then he said, because the elder Esau passionately craved lentils, which the younger prepared the meal, what could be clearer than the reference that these two promises is to the people of Israelites and to the whole world. The former according to the flesh, and the latter according to faith, right? So he's tying it very clearly, and now he embeds the language of hierarchy of power, not just hierarchy of values, that the elder people of the Jews should serve the younger Christian people. Now, Augustine is known for the so-called witness doctrine, that is, that Jews should be protected and not attacked. And at the time they were attacked, some synagogues were destroyed and were attacked. And so he ties it to the mission that is related to the punishment that Jews bear for, again, he goes back to the trope of Jews killing Jesus, which is, again, not quite true. The Jews who killed him and refused to believe in him were dispersed all over the world, and thus, by the evidence of their own scriptures, they bear witness for us that we have not fabricated the prophecies about Christ. It is in order to give this testimony, which in spite of themselves they supply for our benefit by the possession and preservation of those books, that they themselves are dispersed among all nations, wherever the Christian church spreads. Hence the prophecy of the book of Psalms, do not slay them, lest at some time they forget our law, scatter them by the might. So the doctrine of Jewish exile, both as a punishment but also in service, is something that we should keep in mind, because I think it's playing itself out in strange ways today. And he says, look how he's continuing, and this is actually preceding, it is a great confirmation of our faith that such important testimony is borne by enemies. So Jews are cast here as enemies. The believing Gentiles cannot suppose these testimonies to Christ be recent forgeries, for they find them in the books held sacred for so many ages by those who crucified Christ. And the unbelief of Jews increases rather than lessens the authority of these books. For this blindness itself is foretold. So this is just theology, right? This is a bishop writing, thinking through theological texts in a certain moment, political moment. But at the time he was writing, there were already laws that began to implement in social reality that hierarchy, that theological hierarchy. We begin to see laws that single out Jews as a group. There were laws against heretics, against pagans, but Jews as a specific group that begin to create a legal structure, right? We are familiar with structural racism that functions within the legal system. We are beginning to see legal structures concerning Jews. So there was slavery in the Roman Empire, not racialized as it would be in the colonies here, but there is now prohibition from Jews owning Christian slaves. It's not against anybody owning Christian slaves. Christians can own Christian slaves, but it's against Jews having Christian slaves. And the second law, which is a few decades later, actually introduces the language of power, right? So if one of the Jews shall buy and circumcise a Christian slave or any other sect, he shall be raised from, he that is the slave, shall be raised from the Jew's power, and remain in liberty. Christianity, again, remember that freedom, liberty, those free woman, that is now echoed in the legislation. And then other laws were introduced targeting Jews. They were excluded from public office. They were prohibited from practicing law and serving in state service, lest people of Christian law serve them, right? So lest they be in a position of authority over Christians, and then Christians might think that because of this mastery, the venerable religion of, they might convert perhaps to Judaism. And then Jews shall not be appointed judges over Christians, right? Again, positions of authority. And not permitted to be tax collectors, for those Christians would be seen, God forbid, to be subjected to them. We're seeing, again, the language of social hierarchy, not just hierarchy of value. Then there was prohibition of intermarriage and prohibition against admitting Jewish witnesses against Christians. Again, and if you know anything about race laws in the United States, these are exactly the same laws that we see here. That enters, once the way law functions, once it enters legal framework, it becomes part of the legal tradition and legal fabric. So it gets embedded and repeated. Here's an example of a letter from Pope Gregory the Great, but it gets embedded in a medieval collection of canon, what becomes canon law. So here again, it's against holding Christian slaves. Jews should not be in servitude by Jews, and no Jew is permitted to hold Christian slave in his power, right? And then Christian slaves should become given liberty, and that becomes later part of prohibition on Jews hiring Christian servants as well. And then in 1215, we begin to have even more explicit. It is absurd that a blasphemer of Christ exercise authority over Christians. And it again repeats a Spanish legislation against Jews, prohibiting Jews from being given preference in matter of public office, since in such capacity they're most troublesome to Christians. And here is the return where we begin to have theology and law coming together in the 13th century. The Jews who by their own guilt are consigned to perpetual servitude because they crucified the Lord. They ought not to be ungrateful to us. The Pope asks the French rulers to restrain the excesses of the Jews so that they shall not raise their neck bowed under the yoke of perpetual slavery, lest the children of a free woman should be slaves to the children of the slave, but rather as slaves rejected by God, Jews should recognize themselves as slaves of those whom Christ's death set free, and at the same time enslave them. Jews should not in any way dare grow insolent, right? So that kind of subjugation of Jews, and the language of slavery is important. This is actually what sort of made me think about these parallels about anti-black racism here. And this is an example from the bull that established a ghetto in Rome, which consigned all Jews to a quarter that was locked at night. And again, that language of perpetual servitude, that they owe servitude to Christians, but they erupt in insolence. What was the insolence? Jews lived like other Romans did. They dwelt side by side with Christians. They were not recognizable by the way they looked. They lived in nice part of towns. They had houses, and they had Christian housemates. And servants, and the popes didn't like that. So he, said that as long as they are tolerated because of the testimony, that is the Augustine, but as long as they stay as Jews, they should recognize the errors to arrive at true light at the Catholic faith. It is therefore appropriate that as long as they persist in their errors, they should recognize through experience that they have been made slaves, while Christians have been made free through Jesus Christ. And then he repeats this: the free woman, the slave woman. That theology is not just limited to Catholic Church. It becomes part of some of the Protestant works, and again the exile as punishment for Jews' crimes, as Christians perceived them. Here, for Jews who are in exile, they should really have nothing, right? So the Pope sends them to a ghetto. Jews should have nothing. Whatever they have must surely be our property. Their present exile must be due to something more heinous, the idolatry, namely the crucifixion of Messiah. And in this writing, Luther proposed a solution, a bunch of solutions, And here is one that I want to highlight because it goes back to that question of exile, that they should not be returned to their land. I advise that their houses should be razed and destroyed, that they might be lodged under a roof or in a barn like gypsies. This will bring home to them the fact that they are not masters in our country as they boast, but that they are living in exile and captivity, right? So through experience, they should do it. Again, this sort of return to the question of exile. That is what God has done, so manifested and brought Jesus to the world, but Jews wouldn't want to hear of this. And however they did this, and that they still do now, they were obstinate and absolutely refused to give it an ear, so refused to recognize Jesus. And then came the Romans who destroyed Jerusalem, took the villains by the nape of the neck, cast them into the dungeon of exile, which they still inhabit, and in which they will remain forever, or until they say, we are willing to acknowledge it, right? Until they become Christians. So that kind of language is to be experienced also by Jews in real life, right? In modern times, we hear these echoes in modern anti-Semitic writings. Here is a Wilhelm Mark who popularized the word anti-Semitism. And he says they are completely Semitic race, loose from its home of Palestine, so that idea of exile. And he says, when Jewish emancipation, that was the word used for admissions to citizenship rights, it's nothing more than an alien domination. And he asked the Germans not to betray Jews, but do not elect them. Right? So don't give Jews political power. Think about those laws for now 1,500 years against Jews having public office, right? So do not elect them as masters of your person. Do not make them legislators and judges. And here's another example. This is from post-war Poland. Where Jewish delegation went to a bishop to ask for help against violence, against the survivors. And the bishop says to them, you're so talented, why don't you help rebuild Poland? But why don't you Jews do what you're capable of? Why do we engage in politics? Can you imagine what it looks like when a priest comes to the ministry like an office, and a Jewish woman is still sitting there, God knows from where, and treats our clergy with superiority and insolence. That's the language. And I'm not sure this bishop is thinking, oh, Paul, Augustine, it's just become so embedded in the thinking about Jews that idea when Jews are equal citizens or are in position of authority because they are citizens and have the right to hold public offices is seen as superiority and insolence. And I want to show you just one example of that. Here is a postcard, a German postcard, and you can anybody tell me what's going on this postcard?
What's she serving?
She is a servant. And do we know who is who on this postcard? Yeah.
There's only one person with a green face. And there's one man standing.
Mm-hmm.
He has a green face. I can't see so well, but his facial expression is, not kind or happy. And then there's 5 women, one of whom is serving, all with pale appearance. Or no, honest.
So these are caricatures of Jews who are clearly wealthy and are being served by a Christian woman. Mm-hmm. And this is the flipped order, that Jews are beyond their stage in social, right? And that was one of the arguments of modern anti-Semitism, that Jews have too much power. And they are racialized, right? They are darker. The green is darker. I'm not sure whether he's actually green, but he's darker. Their eyes are darker. Their noses and lips are darker. And the Christian woman is, and I have a lot of images I could show you where that is very clear trope of that. So what we see, that trope of Jewish power, which is so endemic in anti-Semitic thought, is that it comes actually out of the idea of Jewish servitude that emerges from that Christian thought, because Jews should be tolerated on a humble level. But then through centuries of legal inferiority, as I showed you, the separate laws that are meant to put Jews in a legal inferior position, exclusion from various positions or even society, such as ghettoization or marking Jews, as had happened in the 13th century and on, led to the social and religious contempt. So when we have equality and equal citizenship, there is a backlash, and we'll see it in a moment. And all that is also depicted in visual language. This is the capture of Judea in the year 70. The Roman soldier stands dominating over a woman who represents Judea, who is crying and subjugated. In some instances on the coin, she's actually with hands tied up as a prisoner. Here is a representation of a triumphant church, ecclesia, representing Christianity against the blindfolded, remember that blindness of Jews in Augustine? That blindfolded synagogue, who is a humbled, blindfolded maiden, ubiquitous in the pre-modern period in iconography. They are, again, the contrasts between the Christianity and Judaism. But in the Middle Ages also emerges the idea of the triumphant, imperious church, right? Church as a dominant church. And this is a queen church sitting on or standing with a cross and a chalice. When Europe begins to colonize other lands, that Christian queen, which in the Middle Ages represented Christianity and church, is turned into Europe, Europa Regina. She's still a queen, but you can see that she's still Christian. There is a cross and a globe now, not the chalice of the church, but a globe now. But now she's dominating not synagogue, not Judaism and Jews, but she's now dominating the other continents. And they are all shown in these humble positions, looking down in different levels of clothing, representing different levels of civilization as Europeans began to judge different peoples. And it becomes a trope that is really, this is Iconologia, this is a book that was republished, and it's a manual for painters of how they should represent continents. I mean, all kinds of things. But I'm showing you how they should represent continents. And the Europa is always that queen, that sitting queen, and these various continents are shown in their different kind of strangeness, savagery, and so on and so forth. By the 18th century, Africa is racialized as black, right? In the earlier, Africa is North Africa. That's what Europeans think. But by the 18th century, Africa is racialized black, and we begin to see the distinct rise of a still Christian, but white Christian European identity and domination. And it becomes supremacy, and I use the word supremacy in a very technical way, of having political power of the state behind it. And here's an example of that. from the 1705 Act concerning servants and slaves in Virginia, and look what's happening here. This is very similar to the language of slaves and Jews and Christians. No Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians, although Christians of different race, or Jews, Moors, Mohammedans, or other infidels, or other religions, shall purchase any Christian servant nor any other except of their own complexion. Okay? So if somebody is Christian but not white, they could be perhaps owned. But if any Negro, mulatto, Indian, Jew, Moor, Mohammedan, Mohammedans, obviously Moors are considered Muslims, or other infidel or such, shall notwithstanding purchase any Christian white servant, the said servant shall ipso facto become free. Okay? So here you have that convergence of what we saw earlier in relation to Jews. Now it's both Christian, it's in relation to religion, but also race. And here you have how America changes race over time. So America is a savage woman before United States emerges as an independent state. And then you have Libertas Americana, is that woman that we've seen before, and then Columbia, and you can see that sort of iconographic echo of that ecclesia standing triumphant that we saw in the Middle Ages. And liberty also is this woman, white woman, no longer Christian, it's French Revolution, but echoing that iconography. So during the Enlightenment, we have two things happening. First, we have the invention of race. In the case of Jews, as I'll show you in a moment, Jews are racialized through religion, and they are deemed European and inferior as non-Europeans because they are put in Holy Land, which is outside of Europe, in Palestine, and are inferior as not Christians. We've seen it. And then blackness is invented as a justification of slavery. So all these philosophers who are claiming equality and rights and natural rights are troubled because of what's happening with the transatlantic slave trade. And some of them participate in the transatlantic slave trade. So they figure out that it must be natural for black people to be enslaved, that it is in their nature. So they develop the idea of blackness as inferior, as a sort of perpetual inferiority. And here's an example of how Jews were racialized as non-European, those who lived in Europe by Europeans. So here they are shown in these books, they're proliferating books on the sort of history of religions, which show usually Christianity as the sort of triumphant religion, but they always start with Judaism. But not Judaism of the living Jews, but the Judaism of the antiquity of the Bible, which has animal sacrifices, has all those Europeans think primitive things. And then in these various books, there are also representation of non-Europeans, some of them engaging in animalistic worship or other things. And that they are tied as these primitive, backward non-Europeans. And here's a really cute example where they are comparing Jews to East Indians from India. And here's I opened it on the page where they compared the enchantment of snakes in India with Moses and his snake and staff and all kinds of things like that. So what you have in the modern period, after the centuries of that legal and theological hierarchy, is that these modern ideas of equality and citizenship clash with those established centuries-old ideas of social hierarchy and habits of thinking. So when modern nations are trying to figure out who is the we the people, who are now new nations, they are asking themselves, do Jews belong, do black people belong? That's a debate in the French Revolution. What do you mean all are created equal, meaning Jews have to be, and black people and the colonists have to be equal, right? And there are really vigorous debates. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of equality for whom. In the first debate over what citizenship in the United States during the Missouri debate, Philip Barber of Virginia says that the Constitution of the United States was framed by the states and consisting of European descendants of white men. It had to view liberty and rights of white men. So the Constitution is for white men, right? And from a similar perspective, in Europe, almost at the same time, that debate over Jews is a little longer, is that the idea of human rights was discovered for the Christian world in the last century. It does not apply to Jews. So what you see is race becomes the dominant factor in America, but very parallel language is in religious context, in context of Jews. Here, the emancipations or equal rights, Jews demanded literal parity. They wanted to be equal. But we Germans are, after all, a Christian nation, and Jews are only a minority. They're nothing else but German-speaking Orientals. So you, in South Carolina and United States, the governor wrote to a Jewish community that when they protested that they were not included in a certain pronouncement, he said, like, I've always thought I lived in a Christian land, that I was a temporary chief magistrate of a Christian people. And so on. So in America, too, that Christian ethos never is lost in this way. So we see this, again, this orientalization of Jews, and then the idea that they don't belong, that they belong to Palestine, and they should be expelled from Europe, and that could never be equal, could never be true citizens in this way. So I'm wrapping it up. What we see in the legacy of Christianity and the early Christian theology and then law is that legacy of slavery. In the context of Jews, it's the idiom of slavery and servitude. Jews were never enslaved in Europe, but were referred to as such. But it did result in a legal subjugation and in the theology of punishment, that they should be punished. They should not have anything. They should be not living in a dignified conditions. And habits of thinking about Jews as inferior, because that inferiority is a sign of rejection and punishment. So they don't deserve to be in position of the achieve, not because they are not capable of, but because they shouldn't, because they are punished. They are forever punished by God until they believe. In terms of anti-black racism, that's a legacy of an actual enslavement. That is justified by the racial ideology of black inferiority. And it also leads to these habits of thinking about black people as perpetually inferior, but because, and therefore not deserving to be in positions they were, right? We're living in a moment where museums are being stripped of mentions of black people who achieved officers in the U.S. military and so on and so forth, and the whole DEI slur that is all over. But in this case, they are not deserving because they are inferior, rather than Jews are not necessarily intellectually inferior, but they are to be punished and kept in that inferiority. The result is that are both excluded, and they are both kind of subject of political and other kinds of attacks and exclusion. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions and agreements and disagreements. And if you sort of think about something later, here's my email. This is just for the future if you leave the room. Oh, she said something. I want to know. Yes.
May I attempt at condensing it to see if I understood right?
Yeah.
My understanding is that there's a leftover hurt and resentment produced by the crucifixion, which is done by the Jews. They killed Jesus Christ, which produces a desire for revenge, which is unresolved because there hasn't been forgiveness, which justifies the power and dominance, no matter from which group over which group, which is shown through racism and superiority, and because the triumphant vengeance that this dominance produces feels good, essentially.
So a little bit different. So the issue is that Christians are never accept the fact that Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and they claim. And if you read the Gospels clearly, this is the Romans who execute Jesus, right? But the Romans kind of are forgotten or even forgiven, and Jews become the main players of the drama. So the Jews' rejection of Jesus as a Messiah and God, is something that Christians have to come to terms with. And that's when you begin to have that kind of resentment, but also negation of Judaism. So, they don't understand what they are reading. They have all these prophecies, but they're blind. They are wrong. They are rejected. They are punished by God, right? And that idea of punishment is what then justifies the subjugation of Jews. This comes out of theology, right? So that's called replacement theology or supersessionism, that Christianity became the new beloved Israel and replaced Judaism. But when it's combined then with political power of the empire, it becomes supremacy, it becomes Christian supremacy, where Christianity is privileged, in a privileged legal position, and Jews are legally subjugated, right? To enact that punishment, to remind them that they are in an inferior position. And that then is perpetuated both through theology, but also through law, because now if somebody believes something, well, I believe you're inferior, I believe you should be punished, or I believe, it's sort of like your belief. But when you say this is the law, how come you hired Ginny as your servant? You are not allowed to do that. It's a different, it becomes a social reality, right? So what this does then with racism is that it allows Christianity over centuries to feel superior, to gain that sense of dominance and righteousness and superiority, and that develops in the context of Jews. And then when they expand and begin to colonize, then they transfer that superiority also over to race. And that's when it becomes a sort of Euro-dominance, Euro-Christian dominance around the world. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah. So it seems, I guess my understanding is that this is mostly centered in the Western Christian theological tradition. So I was wondering how anti-Semitism appears or doesn't appear in other Christian histories, in the Eastern Church, in African traditions.
Yeah, so in the Eastern Church we have some of in the Greek world. So you have very violent sermons by John Chrysostom. I usually don't include this in the story of anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is a Western tradition. It's a Western Christian tradition. It emerges in Western Europe. It is articulated in the Western Europe. It emerges as a political ideology in the context of citizenship and transformation of Western states into democracies. So that's why I usually don't include it. I usually talk about the Eastern churches when I teach Jewish history, and we're talking about the separation between Christianity and that, but I don't discuss it in the kind of Western world. But it is there. Just to give you an example, Jews were, for instance, not allowed to live anywhere in Russia. And that's a legacy of the Eastern Church tradition, right? So it does exist in the Christian Eastern world as well. I don't know enough about African Christianities, but it does exist in the Eastern Christianity as well, Orthodox Christianity. Yes.
I'd like to just go back to the beginning, and you draw this sort of lineage, and my understanding is that like many of the lineages in genealogy are patrilineal in the Bible, and this seems to be matrilineal. So I'm like wondering if like that distinction is important, and if so, could you explain any thoughts that you have on like, why?
It's a great question. Around the time, maybe a little earlier, maybe around the time, I don't exactly remember, but Shai Cohen has a book, The Beginnings of Jewishness, and he talks about the shift from patrilineal to matrilineal as a shift for Jewishness in that way. So this is reflecting that shift. But obviously for Paul, it serves other allegorical meaning and significance in the way he's thinking about the emerging, what we now call Christianity, and his relationship with Judaism in that way. But it does reflect that shift from the patrilineal to the matrilineal. And now in Judaism, obviously, Jewishness is connected to the mother, not the father, except in the Reform Judaism. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
You used the phrase, which was the invention of racism, the invention of the concept of race,
Mm-hmm.
and in I guess the 1700s and 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that one?
Yes. So there is obviously inequality, and there is slavery is not attached to any race or any racial group. But in the 17th and 18th century, with the scientific revolution and thinking about these hierarchies, and again, they emerge from the sort of study of religion, the European studying religion, and looking at the primitive and reason compared to Christianity in that way. And they begin to sort of establish these sort of social hierarchies as well. But race and that kind of essentializing of factors is really with what Andrew Kern discussed brilliantly in his book Anatomy of Blackness, is with that Enlightenment era obsession with blackness. Like they need to understand what's different about them, that black people deserve to be enslaved. And they go into anatomy. They do postmortems to try to see what color is belong the skin, the bile. They are trying to understand what's different in that way. What's the origin? Like, how can we philosophers be the same as these people who are being enslaved, right? So Voltaire, for instance, couldn't accept that. He was polygynist. He said, it is impossible that they come from the same stock as us. So they must be different. So that's what I mean, that the invention of race as different, and then racism become the ideology that is justifying that thing. So what is interesting is the ideology about Jewish inferiority emerges from a theology, from a moment where Christianity is really not powerful, right? It's a kind of an internal statement of value, affirmation. We are not, we're right, we're okay, God is with us, don't listen to them, they're rejected by God. And then the supremacy comes later. With anti-black racism, it's the opposite. The power enslavement comes first, and then you have the development of the ideology of inferiority and why it happens, right? So it's so it's kind of the direction is different, but it ends up in the same place. Yeah. And when I was doing work on I didn't know I was writing this book. I was just reading. I was just reading about Black history. I am trained I come from Europe, but I also am trained in European history, and I'm Jewish history, and I've been teaching about Jewish history and about anti-Jewish sentiments and anti-Semitism. But I started reading about Black history and American history, and I kept putting on the margins that sounds similar, that sounds similar, that sounds similar. The language is very similar all over. Jews are questioned whether they could be citizens. Black people are questioned, can they be, can someone who was enslaved be a citizen in the United States in the Dred Scott case? So there were all these echoes, and I'm like, both are seen as cursed by God. Both were accused of being lazy. Jews at the expense of Christians, Black people at the cost to white people. So there were these differences, but there were also these eerie similarities, and I thought to myself that this is not just like a coincidence. There's something deeper going on. But the problem is, how can people with such different historical experiences then have this kind of echo? And then what I came to in the book, as what ended up the book and what I showed you, is that the idiom of servitude and slavery is embedded, and power is embedded. And that's the legacy on both sides, except that obviously one was real enslavement and the real legacy. Yeah.
I wonder if it's a fair summation of your organization, that's something that you could draw out of your work, that these categories of religious difference that Christians map onto Jewish people and hierarchize are proto-categories for racial difference? Is that part of what you're saying here, that religious difference is a prototype of what becomes racial?
It becomes, yeah. But it's not, because Jews can convert. And once they convert, all that stuff is going poof, away, right? Whereas racial difference is indelible. You can't change it. But medieval Spain has purity of blood laws that is attached to that Jewishness and heresy become kind of hereditary. And that is very easy then. Who is engaged in first colonization and first enslavement? Spaniards and Portuguese. So that is then very clear, and both the laws and language is again transposed onto justification for the enslavement of Africans and the colonization and things like that. So again, what the main argument is that what comes out of theology and both thinking and then legal structures that develops in the context of Christianity and Jews then provides models and also gives Christianity that assertive power of superiority and dominance that it is then deployed and applied in the expansion. And in the book I show you these sort of parallel tracks that run also in the modern time in this way. And they're not necessarily talking to one another. It's just that these mental habits, these legal structures create the conditions that then allow for similar kind of developments and echoes. Yeah.
So my sense from the doctrine of witness is, as you said, is in part that it's evidence of the cursedness of the Jews, that they exist and look how bad their lives are and they're cursed.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, And you mentioned that the eventual narrative that Jews have this power that they shouldn't have, is certain Christians are trying to right that wrong. I guess I'm curious if you see theological explanations for why that imbalance exists. Like why are the early church fathers or these theologians, do they have explanations of why Jews are having power in the world when they shouldn't, quote unquote, shouldn't be?
Well, the early church fathers are saying, you see, they don't have any power anymore, right? What they are trying to prevent through their legislation is Jews having any authority over Christians. So they don't have power, but they don't have authority. And they want to make sure that Jews kind of feel that inferior, that they should serve the Christian people, right? The younger, the elder shall serve the younger. The idea of Jews having power, that really is a modern anti-Semitic trope. Because that emerges from the moment where suddenly Jews have been excluded from all these positions in life, they were not anywhere, and then suddenly they are citizens, so they are in universities, they are elected officials, they may be ministers, like Cremieux, for instance, was there. They're suddenly in these positions of power, or where they shouldn't be, they haven't been for 1,500 years, 1,800 years, right? And that's when you have anti-Semitism about that, and it's political, like don't elect them. And that's also when you have the protocols of the elders of Zion that are being created, where you have that iconography of these rapacious Jews, Rothschild and others, but that emerges from that place where they are suddenly in places where they shouldn't be, right? And that and that's where it's coming, and it's coming from that ideology of servitude, of being inferior. Yeah. Now the question of power, for instance, that we're grappling with, right? That's why I told you to pay attention to the question of exile, that Jews are supposed to be perpetually exiled as punishment for God. I do think that this part of that anti-Israel ideology, not criticism of Israel and its policies, but that kind of strong, visceral denial that there is a right to exist for that state, is echoing some of those of that power and punishment and exile and Jews are not there, and of course that idea of settler colonialism, that is that Jews hadn't been there, and of course not true because they actually lived there over centuries, but that they were exiled, they were punished, they're not there, and they only come in the 19th century. So that's also a kind of an echo. Like I say, I still have to sort of think it through, but it struck me that it's repeated and it shows up in that way, in similar kind of echo way. And again, it's not the criticism of the Israel and what they do, but that kind of questioning of existence. And
Thank you, Professor.
thank you.